All right, great. Let's get started. So, welcome everyone to this week's Planet Weather Webinar, or webinar, as we like to say. Um, Today, we will be talking specifically about the 6-month weather outlook for Central and South America. And so this is going to be a, very sort of exciting look into what El Nino, or particularly the coming Super El Nino, is going to have in store for this region. And because this region is going to be heavily impacted, this is why, we decided to have today's webinar really focus on this particular area. So my name is Dr. Hansi Singh, and I'm founder of Planet AI. I'm an Earth system scientist. I've worked before for the US Department of Energy, and actually, we are working for them again through the Genesis mission, which is really exciting. I used to be a professor. I still do a little bit of work in Earth system model development, though mostly I leave that to all of my amazing science colleagues. Um, But I decided to start Planets very specifically because I wanted to bring some of this really cool intelligence from the research world into the real world to help real people make decisions. And so here we are. So today's webinar is specifically going to focus on Central and South America. And this is because this region is really in the crosshairs of the coming Super El Nino. El Nino is already here, it is intensifying, and it is going to have major implications for this region. So we're going to talk about what to expect specifically in terms of warming, and then we will also talk about shifts in precipitation patterns. Hi, Avi, nice to see you. And then we will also talk about specifically impacts across the Americas more specifically. So we usually divide South America into sort of two major weather regions, one east of the Andes, one west of the Andes. So we'll talk about them separately. We'll go over implications for South America. And then we'll ask this really important question of when will this Super El Nino end? Because I have actually been speaking to some clients that have been like, oh my gosh, is this going to last for years? And I'm like, no, don't worry. It's not going to last for years. It is going to last for, it's going to peak at the end of this year and then it'll dissipate relatively quickly into 2027. So we'll discuss that as well, just to hopefully allay some of your fears. So before we jump right into the forecast, just a few words on how long-range weather forecasting works. So weather models, which are tied to, say, the weather app that is on your phone, these forecast up to 14 days because they are atmosphere-only models. The atmosphere has a very short memory. It only remembers where it started from for about 14-ish days into the future. When it comes to anything beyond 14 days, we really need a more comprehensive modeling framework. This is where Earth system models come in. These are models run on supercomputers that we can do anything from, studying snowball Earth and the Cretaceous hothouse, all the way to, say, predicting weather patterns over the next weeks to months to years. So this is what we use. And keep in mind, we cannot tell you a day in 6 months that a particular typhoon is going to hit a particular coastal city, but we can tell you, for example, elevated risk of typhoon formation over a particular region and the likely paths based on the circulation that these typhoons will go. So really important to remember the limitations of this type of forecasting. Okay, jumping into the forecast. El Nino is here. It's strengthening. It is very likely to be record breaking. It's going to drive global weather patterns over the next 6 months to a year. And Central and South America are going to be heavily impacted because of their proximity and because of teleconnections. So, a few details about what this is. El Nino is what we call a mode of interannual variability. It occurs everywhere, anywhere from 2 to 7 years. For a little while, people were like, oh, maybe El Ninos aren't happening anymore because, climate change, et cetera. Well, I would say probably the last decade has maybe changed people's minds. the science is always evolving here. The point is, 2 to 7 years, this thing comes back, and it impacts the weather on planetary scales. So all over the world, the weather is impacted by El Nino. And the way that these impacts happen are called teleconnections. So teleconnections are essentially huge waves that travel through the atmosphere and the subsurface ocean and transmit information about this energy anomaly that is El Nino, which stretches across the Pacific Ocean. So we are living in pretty extraordinary times in many ways, and this is one of them. So Nino 3.4 is almost certainly going to exceed 3 degrees by September. So by end of September, we should have an actual for what this number is. Our forecast is a peak around 3.8 degrees Celsius. ECMWF CEAS5 has a peak around 3.9 by December 2026. We can, talk about small details like this, but the point is that this is going to be really record breaking. If you look at the Erie collection of El Nino models, both statistical and dynamical, you will see that like pretty much there's very, very good model consensus on, at the very least, a strong El Nino, and most of the models are in this realm of Super El Nino, with many within this record-breaking realm. So this is going to be record breaking. This is the El Nino index, the Nino 3.4, over the last 45 years or so. And what you will see here is that here's three. And this golden line has hit three. This is the relative index, but the Nino 3.4 itself has never hit three. And this is where the forecasts are, way up here. So yeah, this is definitely going to be something for the record books. And so, it's really important to keep in mind the stronger that events like this are, the greater their impacts are going to be because those teleconnections are just going to be that much stronger. And so, yeah, let's look at some of these impacts. So overall, what are the impacts of this Super El Nino across South and Central America? So El Nino in this region, many parts of this region is linked to drought. So there are many kind of drought-related impacts. So these include less hydropower, less water for agriculture. A major issue is river transport limitations. We've seen this in previous El Ninos, and yeah, it is already at a point where people are discussing this for various waterways. So yeah, I feel like this is one of those areas that is sort of underreported and underappreciated just how important water transportation is. And when water levels are low, transportation gets limited. Less heavy water for industry. This is a very mining and heavy industry heavy region. And so less water availability can mean operational constraints. Um, Temperatures will be high, so grid demand will be high as well. In a few places, we can expect flooding and landslides. So we'll talk about kind of those regional impacts as well as we go through this presentation. And then also linked to, specifically drying is an increased risk of wildfires. Also keep in mind that regions that get a ton of rainfall, they might not be at increased risk of wildfires this year, but they might be at increased risk in following years because the increased rainfall can actually lead to increased vegetation growth, which then becomes fuel for future fires. So just keep in mind, like all of this stuff tends to have, very long-term knock-on impacts. So specifically for the Americas, we have this major El Nino. It is going to be releasing almost a zettajoule of energy into the atmosphere. So it's something like 0.5 zettajoules or something of that nature. And so what this means is that our planet is going to warm and the whole global atmospheric circulation is going to reorganize, and this will impact precipitation patterns, particularly over the Americas. So, one thing we can specifically expect is that over the Americas, remember, for South America, their summer is coming up, and in many regions, conditions are going to be warmer than usual. So, this is a look at our platform, looking through February 2027, and you can see, yeah, it is going to be specifically warmer than usual conditions, with the exception being Argentina. And I'll touch on that a little bit. This is an area that's expecting more rainfall than usual. And so this is an area that we're seeing a little bit of a cooling signal. So, to understand the impacts of El Nino over South America, we have to just look a little bit at the general circulation over South America. So, we have this huge region, the Amazon. The Amazon is watered in the summertime. So, specifically, like Southern Hemisphere summer. So, December, January, February, because the trade winds, they shift southward. They always shift to the summer hemisphere. And as they shift southward, they kind of bring this really moist Atlantic air to the Amazon, creating just a ton of rainfall. This pattern is called the South American summer monsoon. It is just a really kind of important meteorological phenomenon that just keeps this area so nice and moist. And related to that too is this very kind of interesting, diagonal thing called the South Atlantic Convergence Zone. And interestingly, this actually forms because it has to do with these westerly winds that kind of create these funny waves that end up creating a second sort of like diagonal zone here where there is a ton of rainfall. So this is the usual pattern that we see. One thing you will also notice is that the rainfall kind of swings around here. And the reason for that is there's this Bolivian high that parks right next to the Andes, and the Andes just constitute such a great barrier to airflow. And so nothing really moves over them very well, unless you're like way up high in the atmosphere. And so what this means is that, this side, the east side of South America, gets really well watered by the Atlantic through these kind of two features, the movement of the ITCZ and the South Atlantic Convergence Zone. Okay, enough meteorology. So, what happens here? Well, during El Nino, um, when we're in neutral conditions, what we get is that we have this Walker circulation that puts a ton of rainfall over Southeast Asia and Oceania, and a second region of a ton of rainfall over South America. Now, what El Nino does is it essentially moves all of this convection, it moves it to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And so, what that means then is that South America actually becomes a region not of moisture convergence and a ton of rain, but it becomes a region of that's just dry. So we call this subsidence, meaning that air is coming down and it's hot and it's dry. And so it's kind of the sum of this impact as well as how El Nino prevents trade winds from moving that tends to result in this real dry pattern that forms over South America. In addition to this, it's also really important to remember that usually when the tropical Pacific is in neutral conditions, we have this really lovely circulation called the Madden-Julian oscillation that is essentially a very equal opportunity provider of rainfall all across the Pacific and Indian Basin. So essentially the rainfall, you can see it's like moving all the way from East Africa, and it moves all the way to Southeast Asia. So these kind of blue and green colors, Oceania, and South America. Like literally, this essentially like distributes precipitation very well along the tropics in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Now, El Nino just stops this basically. This mode of variability doesn't exist. And another really important thing is that that movement of the Atlantic intertropical convergence halts, and therefore this South American summer monsoon also essentially becomes very weak. And so we can see this if we take a look at the forecast for this region over the next 6 months. So that was September. Here is October. Their rainy seasons are really starting from October all the way into December, January, February. And you see here, this area right here, this is that sort of drying associated with the fact that that tropical rainfall is just not able to shift as effectively down here to water this area of the Atlantic and to bring a ton of moist air to the Amazon region. And so, yeah, this is kind of just a major signal that happens with El Nino. And because we have a super strong El Nino, this is going to be a super strong signal this year. So, what are the implications of drought over this region? We do not usually think of the Amazon as a region for drought, but here we are. And so, what are the impacts we can expect? So, we can expect impacts in agriculture, specifically subsistence agriculture as well as commercial. There's a lot of subsistence fisheries in this region, and those often get very limited in years like this. We can expect limited hydropower. We can also expect important limitations for heavy industry that are going to be depending on water sources, specifically the mining sector. There are a ton of mines within the Amazon because it's a very ore-rich area. And many of these, for many reasons, lack of energy, difficulty with river transport, as well as possibly some of their operations, if they're not recycling water well, there will be impacts. And then finally, as we mentioned earlier, river transport, because when the river's dry, you can't move anything, or you severely limit how much you can move. So, in terms of previous impacts of El Nino years, 23 to 24 was a very strong El Nino year. There were major impacts in heavy industry. Specifically, there were impacts on bauxite production, which is necessary for aluminum. It ended up spiking global aluminum prices. And very particularly, this actually was not because the specific mines involved ran out of water. Many of them have gotten very good at water recycling, which is awesome. But it was actually because the rivers were really dry. So the rivers were at this 122-year low in terms of water levels. And so logistics operations of just moving ore were just halted. And specifically, there was a force majeure by a major company, Alcoa, specifically related to the fact that there was a major cargo vessel that was stuck in a river and nothing else could get through. So, these are the things that happen when water levels get really low in this particular region. Another thing to keep in mind is that wildfire risk is going to be elevated into 2027. So we've seen this in the past. This is northern Brazil, August 2024. So this was after the El Nino had already dissipated, but this area was super primed at this point to burn, and it did burn. So this was the one of the highest years of forest loss. 113 million acres. And it was not intentional. It was literally because of wildfires due to this super El Nino. And so, of course, wildfire smoke is not great for health. And then, of course, public safety issues, issues with potential operational disruption if there are wildfires close by to various, industry sites. And then, of course, another major issue with these wildfires is that it does really increase our global carbon footprint. So, these forests store an amazing amount of carbon. And with a wildfire, you're just taking it right back into the atmosphere, which is a real problem if, the forests don't regrow in a reasonable period of time. So, Other key regions are also likely to be in drought. So this includes Bolivia, which I show here. And it also includes areas at the north of South America, Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana, and Suriname. And so over these regions as well, these are very agriculture and mining heavy regions, and we do expect impacts due to reduced water resource availability. Now, this is not just a story about drought. This is where, things get pretty interesting. This region right here is Rio Grande do Sul, south, like the southernmost province of Brazil. And this region is expected to be significantly wetter than usual. The reason for that is, we talked about how a lot of moisture is transported sort of like along the Andes. That particular system that transports moisture southward along the Andes, it's called the South America Low-Level Jet. That is actually enhanced in El Niño years. And that combined with various frontal systems, we expect a lot more rainfall over this region than usual. This is an agriculture heavy region, and of course, threats to public safety. So these were floods that happened in March 2024. And this was a poor horse named Carmelo who did get saved after standing on the roof for 6 days. So, yeah, these are the kinds of impacts that we can expect. Hopefully, it's not going to be as bad as it was in 2024, but this region is going to get abundant rainfall, which does potentially increase the risk for issues related to flooding and landslides. Now, let's think about Ecuador and Peru in particular. So let's move now west of the Andes. We were mostly looking east of the Andes, so now we're moving west. So in particular, if we look at Ecuador and Peru, particularly the coastal regions here, El Nino just does a number on their rainfall. It just, makes it go wild. And this is just because remember, this area over here is the area where all of that convection, in other words, those storms that create all that rainfall, it's just where it's parked, and these guys are right next to it. So, and then just keep in mind, the Andes are a great barrier, so most of this is really confined to the region west of the Andes. So this includes coastal Ecuador, and coastal Peru. So what are the impacts here? Obviously, impacts on agriculture if you're getting torrential rainfall, impacts on fisheries. You probably have heard of the anchovy fisheries, but there's also a ton of other fisheries that often, due to El Nino, tend to collapse in this region. So that is something that these folks are hopefully keeping an eye on. There are also going to be issues with aquaculture when we have such heavy rainfall, as well as issues with public safety. This region does tend to be prone to flooding and specifically landslides when we get this kind of El Nino torrential downpour situation. If we move south and now take a look at Chile, so Chile right now is coming out of its winter season. This is like end of winter, and next month is going to be early spring for them. And it was kind of exciting because earlier, this year, I was looking at forecasts and I was like, oh, this is wonderful. They're getting more rain because this is a region that does tend to be a bit water resource limited. And in fact, I think that when we were reaching out to some folks in this area, they were actually very excited that there was going to be rain. So that is great. They got their rain. The rain is going to continue, and hopefully it's not going to be too, heavy for them. Notice that this region around Santiago gets wetter, but this region at the very southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, is drier, which is like super interesting. And that just has to do with the fact that El Nino tends to contract the circulation towards the equator. And so Usually storms that might kind of, track this way down here, they tend to track further near the equator. So in this case, further northward. So it just has to do with, real clear physical impacts of this El Nino. Keep in mind that while there is reduced wildfire risk over this region this year, there are probably going to have a ton of new vegetation that is going to grow with this abundant rainfall, which is lovely. But that could end up becoming fuel for um, next year's wildfire season. So just keep that in mind, right? All of these things often have long lead time consequences. And so it's sort of important to understand wildfire risk might be low now, but chances are it will be elevated possibly next year if they end up getting a very dry year following this nice wet year that they're getting. Finally, let's move on to Central America. So it's really important to remember that one of the major impacts of El Nino over Central America is drought. So October, I believe, is one of their wettest months. And here you can see the drying signal shown in these yellow and brown colors. And very particularly, this region is a region that has, of course, a ton of heavy industry as well as agriculture, but it's probably most globally well known, potentially for the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal relies on fresh water. When fresh water is limited, then they actually impose draft restrictions on cargo vessels. So they already imposed these restrictions in July, and these restrictions are expected to be tightened as this drought continues to take hold. And so, what does this mean? It just means that it's going to be more expensive to transport things from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and vice versa through this waterway. And so, yeah, we don't expect that this situation is really going to get much better until next year. So that's the situation here for Central America. And finally, I just want to close by noting that, El Nino, specifically for South and Central America, um, is associated with economic losses that can stretch almost a decade. And we see this from past strong El Nino events. So this is a paper by Callahan and Mankin in Science in 2023. And so here on the left, is a measure of the strength of El Nino teleconnections. And you can see that South America is just very well teleconnected with the exception of Argentina, right? So, or not the exception of Argentina, but it's a bit weaker over Argentina. The point is the teleconnections are strong. And if we look at the marginal economic impacts, you can see that, yeah, this is like pretty strong impacts over this region. Other than sub-Saharan Africa, this is probably the area on our planet that impacted by El Nino, specifically economically, though probably Southeast Asia is very close as well. You can just see this kind of region of great vulnerability to the impacts of El Nino. So, on that note, when is this madness going to end? And in fact, it will end. So most El Niños, they tend to peak around December. This is also what we're seeing in forecasts this year. There are a couple of models that I think say November, many that say December, maybe one or two, once again, that say January. Around December, this thing is going to peak, and then it will literally dissipate very rapidly. When I say rapidly, like, by the time we get to summer 2027, we'll be like, what El Nino? So, this is not going to be a long-lived phenomena. You don't need to worry about, oh my gosh, what if it's like a 10-year El Nino or something. It's just, it doesn't happen. These are just very intense events, but they do dissipate relatively quickly. And so we expect this to be gone by late spring, and we'll be back into neutral conditions over the tropical Pacific. And so hopefully that will give South America a break, South and Central America, but just keep in mind that you know, these economic impacts are often very long-lived. In fact, they can be, as I said, has been shown for previous El Niños to last almost a decade. So just, even once the event is over, the sort of knock-on compounding impacts tend to be quite long-lived, especially in countries that are heavily teleconnected and vulnerable to these impacts. And so I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, so we have our next webinar coming up next month, and specifically on equity market repricing events and being able to anticipate those. This will be with a guest speaker. So really excited to present this information together, bringing together, folks on the equity finance side, along with the work that we do on long range weather. Um, if you miss us, or if you want to see a ton of various videos on YouTube from prior webinars, you can take a look over here. And we do have a primer on El Nino in particular. So yeah, would love to have you take a look at that. So thank you so much. And yeah, appreciate your time. And please, I believe in the comments you can see about questions, and please feel free to send them to us, and we would be happy to get back to you on that. Thanks so much. Take care.